A lot has been made about the reading wars, and many will say they're still alive and well. You only have to go on Twitter to see these battles being waged. Heck, I'm sure I even raised a lot of eyebrows when I called this North Carolina and the Science of Reading, right? Sometimes I have to check myself because I get really excited about the drama of what's happening. But I have to continue to remind myself that we're not picking teams here. The people who are so engaged in this conversation at their heart are passionate because they care about getting kids to read. We know how important it is. And this unbridled, sometimes frenzied passion is because it is core to what we believe will set our children up for success. And so I want you all to really hold on to that today about why we share this passion as you listen to our speakers. And let's try to take off team stripes, if that's even a thing, and listen with fresh, curious ears. Let's have curiosity be the theme of today. With that, I'd like to bring up Kelly Butler, my dear friend from Mississippi's Barksdale Reading Institute, to tell us what they've learned about their deep work to change the trajectory of reading in their state. Good news, bad news. Antonio Fierro, the National Letters instructor, got waylaid by bad weather on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, so he threw in the towel last night around midnight trying to get to us, and we don't have Antonio. But the good news is we have another wonderful person who can help us share the Mississippi story, and Kymyona Burk, who's with us today, and on day four as the K-3 Literacy Director at ExcelinEd. So Kymyona, thank you for being with us as well. We're going to leave some time for Kelly to take questions. So make sure as you're going along, jot them down, and I'll help her facilitate those. We'll leave about 15 minutes. Kelly, you mic'd up? You ready to go?
Did I click the right button?
And let me get you the clicker. We have a clicker.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And are we cued?
We are cued. Click right. There you are.
There we go. I'm really sorry you all are not getting to meet Antonio Fierro, who has been working with us for about 3 years in this project around teacher preparation. He's just a ball of fire, and he's really helped bring us together as a state and help us bridge the gap between K-12 and teacher prep, which we think is a really important way to be going. I want to tell you the story of Barksdale, and I think one reason Johanna invited me is because Barksdale really has the long view of some of this work. We were founded in the year 2000, the same year that the National Reading Panel came into being, and published this report. And so we've been doing this work really from that vantage point. And I'm kind of the last man standing in Mississippi to tell the story that we think is important to how we got to where we are today, which is really exciting. We're so happy to be off the bottom. I wanted to start with some takeaways from last night, so thank you for indulging my new slide deck just to incorporate this, because I was really intrigued by the panel. I thought it was a great panel, and it sort of teed up some of the things I want to talk about today. The quote that we heard, "We can't leave the development of new teachers to chance," is very much a theme that I want to echo today, because I think in many places we are leaving it to chance by having not the strong policies in place that really require the science of reading to be taught. So we want to try to move away from that. We need to build common language, and Laura Stewart and I have been talking about this reading war and how we can begin to find some common language and common ground so that we can move forward and stop fighting each other and get on with the work. So I think building common language is important. It's one of the things that we're working on in the work we're doing in Mississippi. Implementation is key. We heard that last night also. That's been very true in the rollout of our Literacy-Based Promotion Act. And it's certainly been true in how we are implementing changes in teacher preparation. So helping folks understand what implementation looks like and that we're doing it consistently, I think is really important. Purposeful coaching with effective feedback is really, really important to the work we've been doing in Mississippi. You're going to see a slide in a minute that shows kind of a hinge point of when the trajectory changed in Mississippi. And as Kymyona can echo, because she was in charge of helping find all those coaches and train them, it's been a real difference maker. And then it's time to build a national conversation. So Johanna and I have been working for about a year and a half. We've heard collectively or between us from about 21 states. And it kind of jolts you when you think that folks like North Carolina and California and Massachusetts and Connecticut are calling Mississippi to find out what we're doing. Do you know that the stars are lining up or the tables are turning or something? And so we really think that there's a national conversation emerging, and it's even happening especially happening at the teacher prep level. So we're going to talk about that too. Before I go to this slide, let me back up just a minute and tell you a little story about Barksdale Reading Institute. Jim Barksdale is a gem of a guy and a big philanthropist who gave $100 million to the state of Mississippi in the year 2000. And I told some folks at dinner last night the story that he told me when he hired me back in the very early stages of the Institute. He worked for FedEx. He founded Netscape, which is where all this money comes from. But he made a $100 million gift to the state of Mississippi with the intent that we would work to establish the Institute and with the intent that we would work closely with the State Department of Education. And that relationship has waxed and waned over time, but most recently, and since the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, we have been really joined at the hip. And I describe it as the State Department having bandwidth and a real engine to do the work that Barksdale has tried to cultivate over the last 20 years. And so we've made a good partnership, and with the current leadership we have there, it's been really terrific. But when Jim hired me, he told this story, and some of you may have heard this, but I think it's an important one. He worked at FedEx, and if you've ever received a FedEx package, which I'm sure most of you have, you sign this little gizmo, this little computer that the driver will hand you to document that you've received the package. That's really a Jim Barksdale creation, and I think he should be attributed with the fact that FedEx is very global today. But he said to me, in FedEx, we can deliver a package from the middle of Manhattan to the middle of Tokyo. We can track it along the way. We can guarantee its safety and its arrival intact. And we can guarantee that it's on time. And he said, if we can do that, we ought to be able to teach every child in Mississippi to read. And so that's kind of the mantra that I wake up with every morning. I do think it's possible. I do think we have the science that knows how to teach every child to read, except for those who are severely cognitively impaired. And we just need to get on with it. He talked about the drivers doing the same thing every time. And while we know that there are things that teachers do that are different for different children, that essentially the process of teaching kids to read is the same because the brain reads the way it does. And so we know what that science is, and you're going to hear from real experts, not me, about how that works. But if we can deliver those packages and get them on time, there's a certain sequence of things that we do that makes it happen, and I think that's true for the reading process. So I think that we need to move towards kind of a checklist manifesto, if you will, for early reading instruction to really build those foundational skills. So I wanted to start with this slide. This is John Hattie's work, and for those of you who don't know John Hattie, he is an Australian who's done a lot of collection of meta-analyses and mega-analyses of a lot of research that's gone on in education. And while there are some critics about the way that he's done that, I think one of the things that he elevated was he looked at a lot of the research through several lenses that I think helps us in teacher preparation in particular think about what we're doing. And so he talks about the effect sizes for all of the studies that he looked at, and he looked at it through the lenses of student, home, school, teacher, curriculum, and teaching. And you'll see that the thing that had the most effect size were teacher and curriculum. And so that seems to me a really important intersection as we think about teaching kids to read, that the teacher matters and what the teacher's doing, and the curriculum matters. We talked at our dinner table last night about curriculum and the role that it is playing and has played. And I think as we see the emergence of high quality materials, we're going to see that even more. So this is why we're here. This is the Mississippi story. And if you'll see, this is the NAEP scores tracked from the very beginning, and what Mississippi has done to reach the national point. This is a huge and heavy lift. So we're going to come back to this slide, and Kymyona's going to help me walk through this history to tell you some of the events that occurred along the way that helped us get from the bottom to the national average. That's the hinge point. Folks in statistics call that the hockey stick. I call it the elbow because we're sort of doing this to the nation. Okay, so we're going to unpack a little bit the NAEP scores, because not only did we need to reach the national average, we also are showing some growth in our poorest kids and kids of color. And so you'll see on the left-hand side, these are percentages of kids in Mississippi who are considered low income. It's 79%. We're the poorest state, neck and neck with some West Virginia and some parts of North Carolina. And then African American students represent 48% of our population. You can compare that to the national, which is 54% for low income versus 15% for national. So we have a challenge with us. We are a very rural state, and our kids are scattered, and so we find it hard to recruit teachers, really hard to recruit teachers to the vast majority of our state. I know North Carolina shares that with us. We rank 3rd in 4th grade reading for low-income students, and we rank 7th for African American students. And you'll see also on there, North Carolina. I've tried to pull up some of your statistics as well, so you can see how we compare. This is a big jump for us, and the fact that we have so many of these kids is really how we got off the bottom, because we figured out some important ways to improve their reading. When controlling for those two demographics, Mississippi is 4th grade ranked from 39th to 2nd by 2019. And you'll see North Carolina also went up. You all were higher than we were to begin with, but it gives you a perspective about where we are together on this national demographics. And here's comparing another trend, or the same demographics, but comparing specifically North Carolina and Mississippi. You can see that you've been up there. There may be a little bit of a trend going downward for you. But we have really catapulted to try to reach where you all are. So we're proud of that jump as well. But we have a lot of work still to do. This graph is showing you that the percentage of students that are still scoring at below basic. It's diminishing. It's gone from 65% for low-income students down to 40%. And closer to 75% down to 47% for African American students. So again, the Literacy Based Promotion Act that I'm going to describe to you in a minute has really contributed to this, but we still have a long way to go, and because we have so many kids in this category. Here's another way to look at it, just to compare us to the nation. Percent of Mississippi's below basic students now mirrors the national percentage at 35%. down from where we were in 1998 of 53%. North Carolina is there on the bottom too, so we're moving the needle. We're getting better all together. Okay, Kymyona, I'm going to ask you to join me in telling this story. I said earlier that we have the long view. We were formed in 2000 with this $100 million gift. It's still the largest gift for literacy in the country. It couldn't have come to a better place. And we took seriously the National Reading Panel report when it was first published. So we were here, founded at this juncture just beyond that first collection of NAEP scores. So 2002, there are also some handouts on your table if you want to take a look and make some notes to tell the story, to follow this as we do it. All right, so at the very beginning, one of the very first things the Institute did was to fund faculty members, 12 faculty members across the 8 public institutions. There are 15 teacher preparation programs in Mississippi, 8 public and 7 private. And so with the advent of the National Reading Report, we determined that it made sense to try to influence how we were preparing teachers from the get-go. And so I think it was a pretty progressive move to do that at that point in time. So they funded the faculty members with the intent that these faculty members would know and read and absorb the National Reading Panel report findings and begin to introduce it into teacher preparation. My introduction actually to the Institute was to evaluate that funding, to determine whether or not it was making a difference. And so that study was done in 2003. And it was kind of a time study. We were very focused on phonics because we were interested in knowing whether or not what the reading panel was saying about explicit phonics was being reflected in teacher preparation. And what we determined from that study, one of the findings was that on average in the 8 public institutions, you might not know, even learn what all 5 components of reading were. And on average, you were being taught about 20 minutes total in the 2-year teacher prep program, 20 minutes total on how to teach phonics. So from there, we went to 2005. Following that study, we went with some of the faculty to the state board and said, we think that minimally we need to have 2 courses in place that addressed these 5 components of reading. And so we instituted something called Early Literacy 1 and Early Literacy 2, which covers those 5 components, and worked together as a team. The Higher Ed Literacy Council was in its early stages back then. Since it died and has been resurrected, but back then we were together as a group of faculty working to develop course schedules, course objectives, and course descriptions for those early 2. So there was a sense that we needed to sort of standardize these 2 courses in order to make them uniform across the state. So if you were going to have an elementary program, of which we had 15 of those, you needed to offer these 2 courses in order for your teachers to be licensed. In 2007, so we got that in place. In 2007, Barksdale, at that point in time, had been in about as many as 180 schools. We were actually sending coaches out. This was well before the Literacy-Based Promotion Act. And they were working in schools delivering professional development. And in 2007, we realized that we were having to do things over and over again as we taught teacher after teacher who was coming out with, and they were essentially blank slates. They had many of them couldn't name the 5 components of reading. We were still working with basals at that point in time, and there was just a heavy lift in terms of trying to get teachers to be more effective in teaching reading. And so we developed some professional development, and we were sending these coaches, we had about 30 of them at that point in time. And from there, we decided we needed to pull back and actually create some demonstration classrooms to illustrate what it was going to take to teach kids in these under-resourced schools. So we created what's now called the structured literacy block. We put in our coaches as reading teachers, and half of them were reading teachers, half of them were interventionists. We designed a model for a structured literacy block that included a curriculum. We were using ReadWell at the time, which is a very structured literacy approach. We were using a lot of read-alouds, and so we really designed from scratch this sort of literacy block that we wanted to see replicated across the state. Between September and December of that year, we were the reading teachers for all the lowest kids in the lowest performing schools. We had 15 of the bottom schools. And we were the reading teachers for all the kids, K-3, who were at the lowest, so not all of the kids, but the lowest kids in those schools. By December, the kids in the demonstration classroom had outperformed the kids that were still in the homeroom. And so Jim stepped back and he said, for this amount of money, I could send all these kids to Harvard. So let's figure out what the next iteration is going to be. So we moved from that to doing some work around school leadership, because we figured if we were going to go to scale, we had to teach principals how to do this as well. And so we took over 4 schools. This was before charter legislation happened in Mississippi, so we were sort of a stealth charter. And we hired principals, and we immersed these schools in what a good literacy school really looked like. So we provided coaching and coaching materials, all of the literacy materials, and did that for a couple of years. So we're moving up towards this Literacy-Based Promotion Act. Let's see where I am. 2009 also saw, so we've touched on leadership, we've touched on curriculum, we've touched on coaching. In 2009, we also introduced Mississippi Building Blocks, which was Barksdale's first venture into pre-K, which was designed to sort of demonstrate to the legislature, yes, pre-K really does matter. We were trying to garner some data to make that really clear to them. And so we were now touching into the pre-K, which is also a precursor to this Literacy-Based Promotion Act. Then 2010 is when the standards hit. Do you want to talk a little bit about what was happening at the State Department relative to that? Because you'll see we hit a peak there, and then there's a little bit of a slump until we hit that hinge again.
Well, I'm not mic'd up, but I'm sure you can hear me.
The podium is mic'd.
Just use this, and I walk around, Johanna. I'm sorry. So this is going to be really difficult for me, but I'll try.
You want my mic?
No, we're good.
Okay.
So in 2010, I was the literacy coordinator for the Mississippi Learning Institute, which was funded by Barksdale at the time on the campus of Jackson State University. And I was a part of a pilot where I was leading coaches in their efforts to support schools in a feeder pattern in the largest public school district in the state. At the same time, the College and Career Readiness, I'm sorry, Common Core, I can't say that in Mississippi, not sure if I can say that here, but the Common Core standards, we've been banned, were introduced to Mississippi and were adopted, but adopted just kind of on a phase-in basis. So at that time, our teachers were being trained in Common Core, but our students were being tested on our Mississippi assessment. So that was very difficult. So of course, we never had apples to apples. There was always where our teachers were caught between trying to teach what our objectives at the time, not standards, what our objectives were, but then also learning about these upcoming standards. So that kind of led us into, or just kind of dovetails into the Literacy-Based Promotion Act. Do you want to tee that up?
Go ahead. No.
All right. 2013, the law was passed, Literacy-Based Promotion Act was passed, but there, of course, was no staff. There was no office at the Department of Education for reading, even, at the time. They had had one before, but there was no office for reading, no office for early childhood, and they interviewed almost 600 people for the literacy director position and also the other positions as literacy coaches. And out of 600 people, 24 were chosen, and lo and behold, I was chosen to lead them. Yeah, I was shocked too. So I was chosen to lead them. But let me tell you why that's extremely important. And we've had our friends from Louisiana that contacted us saying, okay, so we're going to hire coaches. And Kelly said, wait, it may not be as easy as you think. At that time, we just didn't have the capacity. The department wanted to make sure that they looked for quality and not quantity. So I have all of these these headlines that say, with all of the national board teachers in Mississippi, or you mean to tell us that there are no teachers who can serve as literacy coaches? But it wasn't just about being nationally board certified. It was, do you know the science of reading, and do you play well with adults? Because coaching is a combination of both. Okay, you know what you know, but you have to be able to impart your knowledge and also build those relationships. Okay, so we know that. All right, so we hit the ground running. For our state, we did not have a lot of time. Law was passed in 2013, and the first cohort of students who would be assessed and promotion retention would be determined was going to happen in 2015. So we had less than 2 years. We had attorneys calling, asking us if it was legal. We had all of those things happening at the time, but it was just extremely important for us to make sure that we equipped our teachers with what they needed. What also helped was that our legislature at the time funded us with $9.5 million for our first year. Now, there are states, even your state, you've given a lot more money than that. But with the $9.5 million, we were like, okay, so let's see what we can do with this. With $9.5 million in the very first year, we procured letters training. We went through the entire RFP process. We procured the letters training. We hired, of course, the literacy coaches, and we also procured a statewide assessment system. So with our law, there were several components that would kind of give accountability, I believe, at other levels that weren't being held responsible for third grade preparedness before. And we called that our MCAS system, our Mississippi Kindergarten Assessment System, K-3 assessment system. With that system, it housed our kindergarten readiness assessment, which was also key, our universal screener, and also our third grade assessment for promotion. So again, I call it the perfect storm because at the same time that the LBPA was passed, again, shortly thereafter, our kindergarten readiness assessment was passed. There had never been any accountability for kindergarten before, and not just for kindergarten, but also with the universal screener component, there's now accountability for our first grade and second grade teachers and third grade teachers to identify deficiencies early and then to do something about it. Because without a state test, teachers want K2. Hey, we can watch some movies, we can do some things, and the third grade teacher will handle the reading part. Okay, so now we have the accountability at that level. So again, 2013, we started. A lot of what my role was at the time was to really do PR. PR is extremely important when you have to have the buy-in from your stakeholders. I mean, it just is what it is. You have to make sure that parents, teachers know that you're doing what's best for children. But also with the letters training, I saw your language on develop a common language. Yes, we had to develop a common language for what it meant to teach children how to read. Those struggling students, the students that you really don't hear about or you don't see on the teacher videos. I don't know if they still do those. But the teacher videos where they have the video kids and everyone's raising their hands and all students are engaged and nobody's throwing paper, those things. But we had to develop a common language for what it meant to teach students how to read. And we did that through letters training. Now, one thing that we did was we used only national letters trainers. We did not do a TOT model.
You want to describe to this audience what letters is? Because some may not know.
The Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling, developed by Louise Simotz and Carol Thomason, and it is not a curriculum. So we did have higher performing school districts that said, we don't want to adopt the curriculum. And we're saying, well, no, it's not a curriculum. It's to increase your teacher's knowledge as to what to do with the curriculum that you've chosen. So once we increase the teacher knowledge about the science of reading, the components that must be present in a curriculum, all of those things, we saw districts beginning to change their adoptions. I had a vendor that was really upset. And I was like, well, I empower teachers, so, we'll take that. They were upset because, now the teachers knew more, so they expected more out of curriculum. But anyway, so with letters, we began to blast the state. So we had literacy coaches. We placed them in our lowest performing schools. The first year we started with 50 schools and about 23 coaches. As of this year, there are 182 schools with approximately 80 literacy coaches. And that was extremely important because, again, our teachers were asking, so how do we get ready? So it's so important that when you pass a law, that you have to give the supports that they need in order to implement the law. You can't just say, we need children reading by 3rd grade, go for it. All right, so it kind of gave us some credibility to say that we're not only going to pass this law, but we're going to help you get there. So we began training all of the teachers in the state. Like I said, first with our literacy, our lowest performing schools. We even invited IHL initially to the table. It didn't go well. But there ended up being some accountability for IHL that kind of brought them back around. We asked our reading professors, hey, we have letters training. We'll offer it to you for free. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. We use a lot of acronyms in education. Our institutions of higher learning. So I believe you call them IHEs here, maybe? Yeah, so our institutions of higher learning. So we invited our reading professors and said, we're offering this letters training, it's free. Once they received all of those books, the modules, I don't have that kind of time. Hey, thought I had the time to do it, I don't really have the time to do it. And so many of them just declined our offer at that time, and that was around 2014. So in 2015, our fearless leader, Dr. Carrie Wright, decided to restructure the Department of Education because we've now worked with our legislature and we have all these components of the law and we're expecting school districts to do these things and implement these things, but our structure at the department didn't even allow for us to support them in that way. As an aside, please do not take it for granted that everyone knows what an intervention is or how to provide them. So we had this big component of our law that talked about intensive interventions, and we spoke about it all across the state, but we didn't have an office to support interventions, and we had not really given any clear guidance about interventions, the amount of time, which kids, what tier 2 meant, tier 3, none of that. We just, hey, interventions, go forth and be great, right? So in 2015, our state superintendent restructured, added the Office of Early Childhood, added an Office of Intervention Services, and my role at the time, when I began in 2013, I was the K-3 Literacy Director, but also just increased my responsibilities to be the K-12 Literacy Director during that time. And that was the first year that our students, the assessment would count towards promotion and retention. My daughter, Kirsten, was in that first cohort. So I was invested. I was invested in how the assessment looked. I was invested in the communication that would go home to parents, if parents would understand that, how the report looked, what would happen afterwards, all of those things, because I was going to be a parent that would be receiving that information. So it went into effect, and surprisingly, about 85% of our students passed the first test. Well, don't get too excited because they only had to pass above the lowest achievement level. So they had to pass with a level 2 or above. Mississippi has 5 levels. Level 1 is minimal, 2 is basic, 3 is pass, 4 is proficient, and 5 is advanced. So our first year, our students passed 85%. And we were excited because all the headline said that there will be 50% of our kids who failed and all of those things, so we really felt just kind of vindicated and okay. But in 2016, we went back to the legislature with a technical amendment. Once you get into some things, you really kind of find out the kinks. So a part of our good cause exemptions, we have 5. A part of our good cause exemptions would be some students may be exempt if they have an IEP 504, if they've been retained, but there had to be documentation of 2 years of intensive interventions. And remember, we had not really provided any guidance, so we started seeing good cause exemption paperwork where they had students on the computer for intensive interventions. No teacher, you're like, amen. Yeah, there was no adult no human presence, but these interventions were intensive. So we started seeing these things. So we went back to the legislature, and again, our law is fashioned after Florida's, but there were some components initially that we did not include. The individual reading plan was one of those components. So as a part of our technical amendment asks in 2016, we added the individual reading plan. But at that time, we also asked that 2018, 2019 would be the year that we actually increased the level for our students to pass. So last spring, our students had to pass with a level 3 or above instead of a level 2 or above. Let's see.
So that brings us to 2016, when we passed the Foundations of Reading test requirement for all undergraduates, elementary majors to pass before they can be licensed.
And I'll take my seat so you can start talking about that. But this is the critical point for teacher prep, when our professors, our reading professors, called us and said, oh, so about that free training you were giving. Because now their students had to pass this assessment, and now they are held accountable for scores and for passing rates and those things. So that was really kind of the carrot stick to get them back on board. And Kelly was very instrumental in doing that.
Well, with your help. So thank you, Kymyona. Those were really intensive times, as you can see. And one of the things that, from the Barksdale perspective, was when the Literacy-Based Promotion Act was passed, the state turned to us and said, give us some assistance on how we should roll this out. So we loaned 2 of our coaches who had been in the field all that time to the State Department to help structure, define what the coaching role would be, help interview those or determine who those qualified candidates were, and prescribe kind of what kind of training was going to happen. So this work that Barksdale had been doing around school leadership, because the Literacy-Based Promotion Act training also began to touch principals. It definitely used coaching model, were all things that Barksdale had been working on up until that point. So in many ways, we feel like the state, with the passage of the law, took the Barksdale model to scale, which we had not been able to do, and that was very helpful. But one thing I want to say about this, to me the hinge point is, until we passed a law that said we have to get this job done by the end of 3rd grade, everybody was relatively complacent. And very few folks really knew the science of reading. And so it really took the law to bring all of that into focus and to get folks to act. Now, in the wisdom of the legislature, they gave money to do that. And in the wisdom of the State Department, they retained control over how that money was going to be spent. Because we have lots of experience in giving districts money, and some of this is bearing itself out in North Carolina, of giving districts money and they not know what to do with it. And so you have 1,000 flowers blooming, and ends up many of them are dandelions. So I think that part of what Mississippi did well was to retain that control. Barksdale had introduced letters back in 2010 to a group of faculty that we had still been working with, and so by the time the law passed, when we determined what was the kind of training we needed, we had already done some piloting with letters to determine that that was probably the best way to go. So 2015, Barksdale went back. We did, when we got to 2016 and put that law in place for the Foundations of Reading, but in 2015, Barksdale went to the Commissioner of Higher Education and said, we've just passed a law in Mississippi that's going to require 3rd graders to pass a test in order to be ready for 4th grade. Maybe we need to take a look at what's happening in teacher preparation, because back in 2005 we instituted those 6 hours, and maybe it's not enough. And so Barksdale replicated the study that I'd done in 2003, but this time all 15 deans stepped up and said, we'd like for you to review our program. The way we were able to do that was we promised 2 things: that we would give them each an individual report that would be confidential and only for their faculty, for their deans, and the deans could decide what to do with it. We were coming off of the heels of the National Center for Teacher Quality that had pissed everybody off by ranking them and publicly, and we promised that we weren't going to do that. And so the deans voluntarily and graciously invited us into their programs, and I'm going to give you a quick overview of what that study is. Some of you have seen this when I was here about a year ago, right after this study, but we're going to touch on that. So we got to 2019. I want to underscore here the importance of coaching that really made the difference in the rollout that we did. And here's what happened in Alabama when they stopped coaching. There's a juncture there where they began to pull back, and we actually built a lot of our early work around the Alabama Reading Initiative, which they were doing successfully. So there's some lessons to be learned from how different states have done it. All right, so $50 million a year to retrain K-3 teachers. We felt like that's a big investment if they're really coming out with not enough to know to start teaching on day one. So Barksdale repeated the study in 2014 and 2015. This time, all 15 of the programs participated. That resulted in a governor's task force, which represented every level of the system, from kindergarten teachers to college deans. And we worked together over the course of a year to come up with some very specific recommendations about what we needed to do relative to teacher preparation. One of the key findings from that report from the second study was that the science of reading was largely missing still at every level. That work of the governor's task force then catapulted us to this Mississippi Momentum Project, which Johanna has been interested in, which is our work with the faculty to provide training in the science of reading. So I want to give you a quick overview. Just there are two or three slides on this. 2003 study determined that we were doing very little around the phonics instruction, about 20 minutes. In the 2015 study, we determined that on average it was about 282 minutes, which is a big jump, but we determined also that it wasn't being done very well, that there was a lot of activity kind of work going on. There was very little modeling in these classes, and we still weren't even teaching, even though the course descriptions mentioned all 5 components of reading, we had programs that weren't addressing all 5 components of reading. How did we determine that? We interviewed faculty, we interviewed deans, we observed every single literacy course that all of the 15 programs took. We interviewed students, we interviewed recent graduates, we went out into the field and observed recent graduates in their classrooms. And from all of those interviews and focus groups and observations, not a single person in that study knew what the simple view of reading was. They had never heard of it. We were still seeing a lot of conversation around balanced literacy. And so from there, we developed this professional growth model to help bring in the faculty to what the K-3 teachers were learning to do. You can't really see this slide very well, but what this is telling you, this is a kind of a compilation of the statewide aggregate from the study. On the left, you'll see Early Literacy 1. These are the actual minutes based on the course schedules and interviews with faculty. We determined that that's where the 282 minutes on average comes from. This is how to teach phonics, not just about phonics, what phonics is, but we looked at actually at what point in their coursework were they actually teaching candidates how to teach phonics. Turned out to be about 20% of the course time. That's for Early Literacy 1, which was primarily a course about phonics. So we were doing a whole bunch of other stuff. So we hear a lot about there's not enough time in undergraduate to get all of this in, but when we really look at how some of the time's being used, we determined that we could do a much better job. On the right-hand side is Early Literacy 2. About 22% of that course time was spent on teaching those 3 components, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, the bulk of it being around comprehension. Again, we were seeing in that this notion of teaching comprehension strategies as opposed to really understanding how the simple view of reading plays into the role of comprehension. We did a quick learner snapshot. We did this for every single course that we observed, and this is based on adult learning theory and also some work out of Johns Hopkins, which looked at what good instruction at the undergraduate level should look like. And these were really troubling. What we determined is that in less than half of the courses that we observed, was it even clear what the objective for that session was. And even if you get 20 minutes into the session, you may not you may just then be, it may be evident what they were trying to teach that particular day. And often it wasn't related to what it should be related to. So we had some really basic pedagogic work that we need to do at the pre-service level in terms of just tightening up how we were delivering instruction, how we were modeling instruction for these pre-service candidates. Only about 50% of the time was the content accurate. So we were still teaching the cueing system. There was a lot of conversation around balanced literacy. There was a lot of things around philosophies of education, about how to write parent newsletters, but not enough instruction about here's how you teach these 5 components of reading. And there was very little time spent on actually modeling instructions. And the overwhelming thing that the undergraduates told us was, we really need to see this in action. We need for somebody to demonstrate how this looks in the classroom. We weren't seeing that either in their student teaching, through their mentor teacher, or at the pre-service level. So this is where the partnership was born, and this is where I wish Antonio was here to talk to you about it. This is a group of faculty that we've been training. We began with about 40, I guess, and when we went to the state, I went to the state legislature after the governor's task force and said, we are recommending a professional growth model for faculty, similar to what the K-3 teachers are getting through the Literacy-Based Promotion Act. Can we have some money to do letters training? And they said, we don't have any more money. So I went to Kymyona. I called her, and then on the spot, I said, can I have 40 of your slots to create a faculty-only cohort for letters training? And she said, absolutely. And so these are the partners in the partnership. It's the Barksdale Reading Institute. It's the Higher Literacy Council, which got resurrected. That's made up of all of the early literacy faculty and members of the senior part of the State Department's literacy team. We started with 40. We are down to about, over 3 years, the attrition is gone. We got about 32 who are regular, so that's pretty good. But I would say of those 32, there may be 6 or 8 who are really beginning to change their practice in their classrooms. Now, if you look at the National Center for Teacher Quality's last rankings, 10 of Mississippi's schools got A's. I wouldn't say that we've arrived. Our syllabi look different because we've actually restructured them all, and so they look very much like they should in terms of following the letters protocol. But we've got a long way to go, so we're not resting on our laurels with those A's. So there are 4 real components of this professional growth model, and I'm about to be at the end of this. We needed the common language, so we have introduced through the letters materials, that's the training for that all of the K-3 teachers were getting, and now all of our faculty have gotten. Antonio's role has been to come in and provide both the training and these seminars, and then coaching out in the field. So these faculty are getting the same kind of coaching from a colleague. Antonio is a former professor of education, out in the field, modeling instruction that's really beginning to change what those pre-service courses look like. The grid on the right, you have a sample on your table, is the Mississippi Matrix for Early Learning Skills. This is where we come back to this notion of common language. This is based primarily on the Knowledge and Practice Standards of Structured Literacy that was first developed by IDA. We think it's the most nuanced and research-based set of skills that teachers need to be able to know and do. And so our attempt with this was to get everybody on the same page around what these skills were, what the science was we were talking about. So it's designed for K-3 teachers, K-3 coaches, pre-service faculty, pre-service undergraduates, external providers who we think come in and really stir the pot when they don't know the science of reading. And so we've tried to create a matrix that everyone could build from. So that's what that document's for. The second component is that we really looked at pedagogy. Not only did we determine that the science was largely missing from content, the delivery of instruction was also missing. So we've done a lot of work around pre-service instruction using these 2 particular textbooks. The third component is coaching, which I can't underestimate. can't overstate. This is Antonio in the field working with pre-service faculty in their courses. Very hands-on. He did a lot of modeling. The undergraduates loved him. He got standing ovations. And then the fourth component is really critical. We have wedded all of this together on these 4 conceptual models that we think are really important. So each faculty member now has these posters blown up in their classrooms, in the undergrad classrooms, to anchor everything that we do. Wherever we are in the reading universe, we're anchoring it to these conceptual models. So this again is the common language that we're now seeing across the state. And so how do we sustain this effort? What Barksdale is really working on right now is helping move policy around teacher preparation, and we're getting a good bit of pushback, as you can imagine. I tell folks I sort of walk around with a target on my back. Even though the deans have been very gracious in letting us work with them around their programs, they are not keen on moving teacher preparation into the policy pipeline, which we think is important. Remember, until we passed a law that said 3rd graders have to pass a test and 21-year-olds have to pass a test before they can be licensed. But the folks who are training all of these new teachers, and we're spending $15 million to retrain them, it seems to me we need to bring higher education into this accountability loop in some way. So what this sequence tells you is how we're attempting to do that. We are really revamping teacher program approval. The guidelines are getting much stricter. It's not a rubber stamp anymore. We're really going out into the field and looking at what's happening in pre-service. We've standardized the curriculum. We have 15 hours that we're trying to get common across the state. We've got faculty working with us and the State Department on redesigning those, which is one reason we got those high marks from National Center for Teacher Quality, is because those syllabi are beginning to look much more standard. We're exploring some new residency models so that we're actually trying to blur the lines between what happens in K-3 and what happens in that teacher prep by putting them together. We're really urging EPPs to move towards a professional school model that's much more clinically based and get them into the mode of reading the research and reading different kinds of journals to prepare and to translate and digest for their pre-service candidates. The Higher Literacy Council is resurrected. It is our goal of this whole project is to move that into an engine of professional development that would be ongoing and train the next generation of faculty who are then training the next generation of teachers. And then finally, I would say there's some, I know, philanthropists in this room, that philanthropy can play an important role in brokering these disparate parts of our education system and help test some things that the bureaucracy can't or is not willing to test just yet until we see that it can work. And so I'm excited about the partnership we have with Belk in beginning to explore some of those things. So I'll leave you with this thought. This is a quote from Motes and Tolman, who are the authors of Letters. They say, "The mark of a profession is that its members share common knowledge of proven best practices. In the area of reading instruction, truths have been established. Relying on every teacher to reinvent these truths through experimentation is impractical and irresponsible." So I hope that we will go forth and build a common language around this, and we're really excited about working with you really smart people in North Carolina. So thank you. Before I hand over, let me give a shout out to Barbara Foreman, who's here. I'm so happy to see her because she's just retired and I thought I'd never see her again. But the Regional Education Laboratory, of which there are 10 in the country, are sort of our research arms in the Department of Education. And Barbara has been a real ally in the work that we've done in Mississippi, a huge support to us and very responsive. Mississippi has 3 seats on that board, and it's really helped us. So I don't know, where's North Carolina? What region are they in?
Yeah, Southeast.
It's ours?
Yeah,
That's right,
yeah.
that's right. Okay, so just a great resource for y'all.
So I think we have time for one brief question.
Sorry.
Who wants it?
I want it.
Kelly, would you talk just very briefly what role you think the literacy support schools played in that timeline and the early focus on those schools? And how did that contribute to the results in 2019?
When you're talking about the literacy support schools, you're talking about the ones that were targeted by the State Department. Do you want to speak to that?
Okay.
It's really, because you know how they were selected.
Thank you. All right, so our literacy support schools were selected by looking at 2 years of third grade data. An average of those 2 years, we simply rank ordered the schools by the highest percentage of students who were below proficient. We had a lot of schools, of course, in our Delta area that were low performing, and we sent coaches to those schools. And I believe that that's really where our Department of Education began to get its credibility, especially for my office, which was that we were not the audit arm. You know, anytime people hear what the Department of Ed is coming to your building, MDE is coming to your building, they were thinking that we were the same. But when they found out that our coaches were actually there to help, not evaluate, those types of things. And when we began seeing progress in those schools, those lowest performing schools, we of course realized a lot of times the teachers were leaving because they did not feel supported. And of course, with the culture and then the students not performing well, all of that is just very overwhelming. So with someone there to support their teachers, to support the teachers and increase their knowledge and to show them this is what this letters thing actually looks like in practice with your children. Some of our schools began to have a higher teacher retention rate, you know, and all of those things. But once we started seeing successes in those schools, other schools really kind of got on board with that. We had A schools calling us saying, how can I get a coach? And I said, well, your students have to not perform well. So that's not the way to go. But yeah, I think that even our coaching model, districts that did not have coaches, MDE coaches said, well, I'll just, you know, get a coach myself, and can you train our coaches? So.
And those schools, when you started, didn't have a choice, right?
No.
Right.
So those schools, it was mandatory for those schools for all of their K-3 teachers to attend letters training. It was mandatory for their administrators to attend letters training. And it was, again, mandatory for the coach to be in the building.
Let's give our Mississippi friends another round of applause.
Thank you. That's you.